Hello everyone, welcome to this new CUBE conversation. My name is Christophe Bertrand, Principal Analyst with theCUBE Research. I'm joined today by Bill Andrews, the President and CEO of ExaGrid. Bill, welcome.
Welcome to you as well, and thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. You know theCUBE well. We've seen you before, and there's quite a bit going on in the industry. And remind us about ExaGrid and how's your business going, and what is the solution helping your customers with?
Yeah, so ExaGrid is in backup storage. So we are the backup storage target for about 25 different backup applications. And if you think of backup storage, you could put it into three buckets, basically. There's standard or primary storage that you'd normally use on the primary storage side, and you put that behind the backup application. There's pros and cons to that. It gets very expensive with any level of retention, not necessarily scalable or easy to manage or fast, but a lot of folks do it that way. We also have inline deduplication appliances, which will reduce the amount of storage with retention and therefore the cost. However, all of those appliances are inline deduplication, so they're doing that work on the way to the disk. So they're slow for backups, they're slow for restores, etc. And when ExaGrid looked at this, we came out with a third approach called tiered backup storage, where the front end of our appliances are a landing zone. They're optimized for fast ingest, fast performance for the shortest backup window. Also very fast restores because the data isn't deduplicated in the landing zone. But then we have a second tier called a repository where all of the data is deduplicated, including all the retention data, in order to have a very low cost for backup storage. In fact, the longer the retention, the more you save. So we basically took the best of both worlds, the best of a primary storage target for backup and the best of a deduplication appliance, and put those together in a tiered approach for a truly integrated solution. So it's the best of both worlds.
And you mentioned a number of backup applications, as well as some applications that you can also optimize directly. Actually, let's take a look. We have a great, what I call the wall of logos here to look at. And today there is, one that we will focus on more, specifically your recent announcement of Rubrik support. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. So, we've, like you had mentioned, we support a lot of backup applications and a lot of the other ones that are sort of hot in the market today, like Veeam, Commvault, Veritas NetBackup, Haiku, etc. And now we also support being an archive target for Rubrik. So what does that mean? Now, Rubrik has an appliance that tends to have some level of retention, a couple copies typically on the Rubrik, but they have their customers tend to push the retention data either to third-party on-prem storage or to a cloud, right? So the longer-term retention, week 2, 3, 4, or week 3, 4, 5, and up, monthlies, yearlies, tend to be archived out somewhere. So in that case, the cost of the storage becomes very costly the longer the retention. The more copies you have, the more storage you're going to require, the more your cost is going to go up. So what ExaGrid is doing is ExaGrid is acting as a tier that provides data deduplication behind Rubrik. So as you set us up as an archive tier, the data comes to ExaGrid compressed and deduplicated, and we will uncompress that data and further deduplicate it. And as a result, greatly reduce the storage. And furthermore, we have the customer turn on what's called Instant Archive as part of the Rubrik Archive solution. And in which case, not only do we have the archive data, but we'll also have the data that lives on the Rubrik. So it will have it redundantly, if you will, or duplicatively on the ExaGrid storage. What this means then is we can allow you to have another layer of security, another layer of disaster recovery, in addition to what Rubrik provides. And Rubrik's a very robust product, and we're just adding more layers of security and deduplication. In fact, if we bring up the cost saving slide, I can sort of explain what this means economically to customers. So if you look here on the left, you'll see months of retention, and we used months as an example. You could do weeklies, yearlies, etc. But if you look at 6 months, we're going to actually take up the deduplication by a factor of 3 to 1. So whatever you're getting from Rubrik, we'll multiply that by 3. In which case we'll reduce the storage in addition to what Rubrik already does, because Rubrik does some level of reduction as well. We'll reduce it by an additional 74%, reducing the cost by about 50% or more. So it'll be about half the cost of, let's say, the cloud storage as an example, and even on-premise storage. If you jump, let's say, to the middle of this chart, 12 months, we're going to see about a 5-to-1 reduction. And if you look on the right, we're going to be about a third the cost. And if you look at the bottom, 24 copies or 24 months, we're going to see an average of 9-to-1 in addition to what Rubrik provides, reducing the storage by over 90% and being about a fifth the cost. So the longer the retention, the more money we're going to save. And we are getting customers and resellers calling us saying, we love Rubrik, we love the product, we love the security, but the cost of the storage behind that is just too high. Can you help us reduce that cost? And that's what got us to this point. If you want to, I'll go to the next slide. Typically, as you can see here on the left, you see Rubrik with a couple of weeks of retention going off to the cloud. But remember, the cloud will forever cost you money, right? It doesn't stop at 36 months. It keeps going. Every month, you're going to keep paying forever. In addition, with the cloud, a lot of the public clouds charge you anytime you delete files, read files, etc. And in backup, when you hit your full retention, you're forever purging backup. So you're paying to do the purge as well. So when we walk in, customers are telling us, I'm spending $10, $20, $30, $40, $50, $60,000 a month in Azure or AWS, and this is killing me. We need to collapse that cost. We can show the customer in a cost calculator what it's going to cost for ExaGrid over a 3, 4, 5, 6-year period, all in, versus what it's costing them in the cloud. So instead of sending the archive data from the Rubrik up to the cloud, you send it to the ExaGrid you see here. We will keep the most recent 2 weeks because we'll be in instant archive mode, and we'll also keep the long-term reduction. So we're going to add an additional 3 to 10-to-1 or even more on top of what Rubrik already reduces the data. We're going to save on storage costs. We're going to offer faster restores on archive data than the cloud, right? Because if you try to pull any data out of the cloud, it's slow. And we're going to have an additional line of defense for security, especially ransomware recovery. And believe it or not, also disaster recovery, which we'll get to on the next slide. So again, if you can move the slide here. Again, if you look here, here's ExaGrid on site with the most recent 2 weeks. And then you have Rubrik Instant Archive mode again, where ExaGrid is keeping all the data. But then we can replicate that to a DR site, right? So that we have a copy there. And if you could flip it to the next slide, I think this will really pull it together. Here's the creme de la creme, where here's Rubrik now replicating, using their replication to a second Rubrik at a second data center, which means now you can recover from the Rubrik on-prem, and if that site goes away, flood, tsunami, hurricane, fire, whatever, earthquake, you can recover at the offsite. ExaGrid has that data plus all the retention data on-prem as well as offsite. So again, we offer a belt and suspenders for all for the most recent data that lives on the Rubrik, but we also again protect and keep and make sure the customer doesn't lose all the retention data. So we have all of the sort of Rubrik covered, and Rubrik stays working the way it works. We bring all our value to that, and it just makes the entire story stronger.
Right, Bill. And the one thing that I think is interesting, and we'll cover this in a minute because that's one of my favorite topics, DR, and specifically there's another variation, I believe, of this configuration we just saw. The one thing I want to, again, remind our viewers of is 2 things. As Bill said, number one, your investment in Rubrik does not change. Nothing changes. What changes are the economics of the storage and the optimization of the recoverability of that archive or the long-term storage. Because if you are on-prem with an ExaGrid solution, it's going to go so much faster, it's going to be so much cheaper than some cloud options that actually make you pay on the way out. So these are very important factors. It's both operational, from a backup and recovery perspective, it's also obviously financial. And those are important topics because, as we know, there's only going to be more data. And we live in a world today where you mentioned ransomware, Bill, where clearly there will be more attacks, there will be needs to recover. You don't know exactly what's going to hit you, so you have to be ready for any possibility. And having the ability to go back to multiple copies of the data is definitely a best practice. Now, if we look at, I think there was a final configuration, Bill, that I'd like to talk about in the context of primary data being backed up at both locations, which gives you the ultimate flexibility. Let's take a look at the slide here. Maybe you can tell us the big difference between the previous one is here you're adding a landing zone at the DR site. Why do I need to do this?
So you have typically customers either have a primary site where they're backing up or multiple primary sites. And the DR site has no data of its own, no primary data. Therefore, it's just a target site for where the DR is. But lots of customers will have data centers where they have data in all of those data centers being backed up. And you want one location to be the DR for one site and the other location to be the DR for the other site, which we call cross-replication. So what you see here is you see the arrow from the Rubrik going both directions, where there's data being backed up into both locations. And the data is going from the right to the left and the left to the right. And the same is true for the bottom, right, where the data is coming into both locations and cross-replicating. So what you have here is just a situation where customers have primary data at both locations, and each location becomes the disaster recovery site for the other location. And by the way, ExaGrid can do this in a hub and spoke topology. We have a lot of large customers that will have 12, 13, 14 data centers, all with primary data being backed up, but they want all of those data centers being replicated for DR to another data center. But they also have that data center having data getting backed up, and they want the unique data at that data center to be replicated back out to one of the spokes. So we do that as well in larger data center topologies.
Right, and that's really the multi-target, the hub and spoke sort of model. This is really a best practice. I think we need to insist here that the risk is really high. We recently conducted research here at theCUBE Research on Cyber Resiliency, and many organizations are not in a position today to recover the mission critical applications when something big happens. So let's talk a little bit more about what you've seen generally with your customers. I mean, data changes all the time. I think you've surveyed your customers. You know what's going on there. How do they deal with all of this new influx of data? How do you keep protecting without getting to a point where your own system runs out of space? What are the optimizations that you've built in? Because you're getting to very, very high numbers in deduplication. And that's an important point. You may think that your backup appliance or your backup software does dedupe, and sometimes it does, right? But the truth is, the compute it's going to use makes it virtually impossible to really do what you do. So you get some dedupe with backup, which is great. But the truth is you need to really uncompress, to recompress to get to your levels. So can you maybe tell us more about that and about the type of unique technologies you're using to get to these results?
I think there were a few different questions in there. So the first one is, what does deduplication really do for backup? When a backup job comes in, the next one that comes in is almost identical. In fact, we have about 5,000 customers installed in 81 countries. 92% of those countries, 92% of those customers report into our health reporting system. And we can see over time that only about 2% of the data changes from backup to backup. So if you're going to bring in a petabyte backup and then another petabyte and another petabyte, it's going to cascade and build up and require a lot of storage and really drive the cost through the moon. However, if you have a petabyte, only 2% of that is changing from then on. It's very small. So what happens is instead of storing a petabyte, you're going to store a petabyte and then just 2% of a petabyte down the line. And therefore, you take this much storage and you collapse it to this much storage. And the reason why that works in backup, because each backup is virtually identical except for that 2% change rate. Now, deduplication, though, to do what I just said, is extremely compute intensive. So if you put that into the backup application, it'll drag the backup application to its knees. So you don't see any backup application that has aggressive data deduplication. They all have some, and they'll get maybe 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, and maybe in some cases even 5 to 1. But they're not going to get 20, 30, 40 to 1 that you would get if you really had an aggressive algorithm with a lot of compute. So you know that all of the aggressive deduplication is always done in some type of target site appliance. However, if you do that on the way in to the storage, it's so compute intensive that it is very slow to do that deduplication and then finally write to the disk, and your backup window becomes too long. So you don't want to do it all in the backup app because you'll choke the backup app. You want to do it in the backup storage, but you don't want to do it in line because you choke the performance. So what ExaGrid does is, again, a combination, right? We've always found the sweet spot in the technology here for backup. And the first thing is that we have the data come from the backup application to our landing zone. Whether it's deduplicated or not deduplicated, it comes into our landing zone. We do no processing to it at that point, so we keep fast ingest. But then we deduplicate that data in parallel as it's coming into us. We're in parallel deduplicating it into our second tier, the repository. So we don't get that impact, if you will, of the slow performance for the deduplication. Plus, we're keeping the most recent backup in the format that the backup app gave it to us, so we're not impeding the restore speed either. Now, ExaGrid can take backup applications like Veeam, and with dedupe-friendly compression on, we can actually take their deduplication rate and greatly increase it, and leave Veeam deduplication on. With Commvault, we can have Commvault leave compression and deduplication on. We can uncompress the Commvault data coming to us, and again, further deduplicate it to a much more fine granular level. With Rubrik now, the Rubrik data comes into us compressed, and with Rubrik deduplication, we uncompress it, we further deduplicate it. So the backup apps will give you some level of deduplication, but they're not going to give you everything you need to fully get the lowest cost storage you can. Now, on scalability, that's a different question. Each of our appliances has processor, memory, networking, and storage. So if the data doubles, triples, quadruples, quintuples, we double, triple, quadruple, quintuple everything, right? The processor, the memory, the networking, and the storage, right? So we're bringing compute with capacity. So as you're growing, you just keep adding appliances into a scale-out system. And the backup window stays fixed length. If it's 6 hours at 100 terabyte, it's 6 hours at a petabyte, it's 6 hours at 3 petabyte, because you're adding all the resources along with the storage versus just adding storage shelves and bringing no more compute resources to bear with that. So that creates a fixed length backup window as the data grows. And in fact, ExaGrid can take in a 6 petabyte full backup into a single scale out system. And that is the largest system in the world that includes data deduplication in the appliances.
Well, thank you, Bill. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think, to summarize, and I think it's important, first of all, and that's something that lots of people know, especially in the enterprise space, you may be running multiple backup solutions just by virtue of acquisitions, choices, etc. So having one unified and optimized deduplication solution is very critical, and clearly ExaGrid can do that for you. I think the numbers and the way you get to those numbers is very, very interesting, because it allows you not only to implement best practices for disaster recovery, best practices for operational efficiency. I really like the predictability point you were making with the ability to scale out all of the resources at the same time. I mean, all of this is really what the market needs today. Why? Because there's only going to be so much data. It has become absolutely imperative to protect the data and everything you have, because you don't know who's going to hit you with what. Cyber risk is absolutely a problem. And then, of course, data is key for other purposes. We haven't talked about AI, but there are plenty of use cases there that are emerging with the backup data and archive data. So, Bill, thank you so much for your time. Great solution. Thousands of customers around the world using your solution, and this new platform support of Rubrik. Thank you, Bill, for your time.
And thank you for having me. It's been fun.
To our viewers, thank you for watching us, and we'll see you on the next one. My name is Christophe Bertrand, Principal Analyst at theCUBE Research.